The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Metropolitan Courthouse, where justice was supposed to be blind. But on this particular Tuesday, it seemed justice had perfect vision, at least when it came to judging appearances. Among the stream of lawyers in pressed suits and polished leather shoes walked a woman whose presence commanded attention for all the wrong reasons. Zephyra Whitmore moved with quiet grace, despite the worn soles of her shoes that had seen better decades. The left one had a small hole near the toe, carefully covered with electrical tape that had long since lost its adhesive strength. Her navy dress, though clean and modest, bore the subtle signs of countless gentle washes and careful mending, yet there was something in her posture, in the way her silver hair was neatly pinned back, that spoke of an inner strength that no amount of worn fabric could diminish. She clutched a manila folder containing documents that could change her life, papers that represented her fight to save the community center that had been her life's work for the past 15 years. The Harmony Community Center wasn't just a building to her. It was a sanctuary where single mothers learned job skills, where elderly residents found companionship, and where children had a safe place to dream of better futures. As Zephyra entered the courthouse, she was unaware that the man who would decide her fate had his own story, one intricately connected to hers in ways neither could imagine. 3 years earlier, Judge Cornelius Blackwood had been just another ambitious attorney with political aspirations and empty pockets. His campaign for the municipal court judgeship had been hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured balloon. Late-night strategy sessions with his campaign manager Dmitri had become exercises in creative accounting and desperate fundraising calls. "We need a miracle, Cornelius," Dmitri had said during one particularly bleak evening. "Or a wealthy patron saint." That patron saint had appeared in the form of anonymous donations, substantial ones that arrived precisely when needed most. $50,000 for television advertisements, $25,000 for direct mail campaigns, another $30,000 for election day operations. The checks came from something called the Urban Hope Foundation, with no return address and no requests for access or favors. Cornelius had won his election by a comfortable margin, crediting his victory to his compelling message of law and order. He had never bothered to investigate who the Urban Hope Foundation really was, assuming it was just another political action committee that preferred to remain in the shadows. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment across town, Zephyra had watched the election results with quiet satisfaction. The Urban Hope Foundation was her creation, a private foundation funded entirely by the inheritance she'd received from her late husband, a successful but humble businessman who had shared her passion for helping others. She had researched every candidate carefully, ultimately supporting Blackwood because of his stated commitment to protecting community resources and treating all citizens with dignity. She had chosen to remain anonymous because she believed in the purity of giving without expectation of recognition or reward. Her husband had taught her that the most meaningful generosity happened in the shadows, where ego couldn't contaminate intention. Now, 3 years later, Zephyr sat in the back row of Judge Blackwood's courtroom, waiting for her case to be called. The irony was exquisite, and entirely unknown to either of them. The woman in broken shoes had literally paid for the black robes that would sit in judgment of her. Case number 2025 CV 8847 Whitmore versus Metropolitan Development Corporation, the bailiff announced. Zephyra rose, her worn shoes making a soft scuffing sound against the polished floor. She approached the plaintiff's table, where she would represent herself. A decision born of financial necessity rather than legal confidence. Judge Blackwood looked up from his papers, and his expression immediately shifted. His eyebrows raised slightly as he took in her appearance, his gaze lingering on her patched shoes and faded dress. It was a look Zephyra had encountered many times before, the quick assessment that reduced her to her material circumstances. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Blackwood said, not bothering to hide his condescension, "I see you've chosen to represent yourself today. Are you certain you wouldn't prefer to postpone until you can secure proper legal representation? Thank you, Your Honor, but I'm prepared to proceed, Zephyra replied, her voice steady despite the subtle slight. The case was straightforward on its surface, but complex in its implications. Metropolitan Development Corporation wanted to purchase the building that housed the Harmony Community Center, claiming the property under eminent domain for a luxury condominium project. Zephyra argued that the community center served a vital public interest and that alternative locations were available for the development. As she presented her case, Judge Blackwood's attention seemed divided between her legal arguments and her appearance. He interrupted her frequently with procedural questions that seemed designed more to fluster than to clarify. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said during one such interruption, "perhaps if you invested as much in legal counsel as you do in—" He paused, his eyes dropping to her feet, "footwear, we might proceed more efficiently." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Zephyra felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "Your Honor, I believe my arguments stand on their legal merit regardless of my appearance." "Indeed," Judge Blackwood replied with a smirk, "though one might wonder about the financial management skills of someone seeking to preserve a community center while unable to afford proper shoes. Perhaps this community center of yours suffers from similar resource management issues?" The cruelty of the comment hung in the air like smoke. Zephyra gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. She had faced poverty with dignity, had channeled her late husband's wealth toward helping others rather than adorning herself, had sacrificed her own comfort for the greater good, and now she was being mocked for those very choices by a man whose career she had unknowingly funded. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "the Harmony Community Center has served over 3,000 individuals in the past 5 years. We've helped people find jobs, provided childcare for working parents, and offered educational programs for seniors. Our financial records are available for review and show responsible stewardship of every donated dollar." "Donated dollars," Judge Blackwood repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "From whom, I wonder? Other people who can't afford shoes?" The courtroom fell silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning system. Zephyra closed her eyes for a moment, drawing on reserves of patience she had cultivated through decades of quiet service. "From people who believe in the dignity of every human being, regardless of their circumstances," she replied. Judge Blackwood was about to respond with another cutting remark when the courtroom doors opened. Dmitri Volkov, his campaign manager, entered hurriedly, his face flushed with urgency. He approached the bench and whispered something that made Judge Blackwood's expression change dramatically. "Your Honor," Dmitri said, loud enough for the court to hear, "I apologize for the interruption, but there's been an urgent development regarding the Urban Hope Foundation matter we discussed earlier." Judge Blackwood's face went pale. "Not now, Dmitri." "Sir, with respect, it can't wait. The Foundation's representative is here, and there are questions about the property involved in this very case." Zephyra's heart began to pound. She had established the Urban Hope Foundation in her late husband's memory, but she had kept her involvement completely confidential. How could there be any connection to her case? "What exactly are you suggesting?" Judge Blackwood asked, his voice strained. Dmitri pulled out a folder and handed it to the judge. "The Urban Hope Foundation has been the anonymous benefactor behind your campaign funding, sir, and according to these documents, the foundation's founder and primary donor is—" He paused, looking directly at Zephyra. "Mrs. Zephyra Whitmore." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Blackwood's hands trembled as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning documents that confirmed what Dmitri had just announced. Bank records, donation receipts, incorporation papers, all bearing Zephyra's name and signature. Zephyra sat motionless, her secret suddenly laid bare in the most public way possible. She had never intended for this moment to arrive, had never sought recognition or gratitude for her political contributions. The irony was almost too painful to bear. She was being humiliated, by the very person she had helped elevate to the bench. Judge Blackwood looked up from the papers, his face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning comprehension. The woman he had been mocking for her worn shoes had contributed over $100,000 to his campaign. The community center he was considering shutting down was run by the person who had made his judicial career possible. "Whitmore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Is this accurate?" Zephyra stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. "Yes, Your Honor. The Urban Hope Foundation was established with my late husband's estate. We believed in supporting candidates who would serve all members of our community with fairness and respect." The weight of his behavior crashed down on Judge Blackwood like a collapsing building. Every snide comment about her appearance, every questioning of her competence, every assumption about her worth, all directed at the woman who had believed in him enough to fund his dreams. I need to recess," he stammered, his judicial composure completely shattered. "Your Honor," Zephyra said gently, "if I may. I didn't make those contributions to buy influence or special treatment. I made them because I believed you would be a fair judge who would evaluate cases on their merits, not on the appearance of the people who came before you. I still believe that person exists within you." Judge Blackwood removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, the full magnitude of his failure settling into his consciousness. He had become everything he had once claimed to oppose, a person who judged others by their material circumstances rather than their character. "The court will recess for 30 minutes, he announced, his voice hollow. During the recess, Judge Blackwood sat alone in his chambers, staring at the law degree on his wall. The Latin inscription, "Justitia omnibus," justice for all, seemed to mock him from its ornate frame. He thought about the oath he had taken, the promises he had made, to serve justice blindly, without prejudice or favoritism. There was a gentle knock on his door. "Come in," he called, expecting his clerk or bailiff. Instead, Zephyra entered, her worn shoes silent on the thick carpet. She held a cup of coffee from the courthouse vending machine. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting the cup on his desk. Judge Blackwood looked up at her, this woman he had so cruelly misjudged. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because everyone deserves compassion, especially when they're confronting their own mistakes," Zephyra replied, taking a seat across from his desk without invitation. "You should hate me," he said. "I humiliated you in front of a courtroom full of people. I questioned your competence, mocked your appearance, dismissed your work. And you made my career possible." Zephyra smiled sadly. "Hatred is a luxury I can't afford, Your Honor. It's too expensive, and, frankly, I've learned that the people who hurt us often do so from their own pain or insecurity, not from any real malice." Just like that. "That doesn't excuse what I did." "No, it doesn't. But it explains it, and explanation is the first step toward change." Judge Blackwood sipped the coffee, surprised by its warmth and quality. "Why didn't you tell me who you were? Why didn't you use your influence?" "Because influence bought with money isn't real influence. It's coercion. I wanted you to be the judge our community needed, not because you owed me something, but because it was right." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the revelation settling between them. "What happens now?" Judge Blackwood asked. "Now you decide what kind of judge you want to be," Zephyra replied. "Not because of what I did for your campaign, but because of what you believe about justice and dignity, and the worth of every person who walks into your courtroom." "And the case?" "Judge the case on its merits. If the community center deserves to be saved, save it. If it doesn't, then let the development proceed. But make that decision based on law and justice, not on guilt or gratitude." When court reconvened, Judge Blackwood looked like a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something deeper and more genuine. He addressed the courtroom with a humility that was both unexpected and profound. "Before we proceed," he began, I owe Ms. Whitmore and this court an apology. My comments earlier were inappropriate, unprofessional, and completely contrary to the principles of justice this court is meant to uphold. A person's worth and the merit of their case has nothing to do with their material circumstances or appearance." He paused, looking directly at Zephyra. "Ms. Whitmore, your dignity in the face of my rudeness has taught me more about justice than all my years of legal education. I am deeply sorry." The apology was met with surprised murmurs from the gallery. Zephyra nodded graciously, her expression serene. "Now," Judge Blackwood continued, "let's examine this case based solely on its legal merits." What followed was a thorough, careful analysis of the law, the community impact, and the public interest. Judge Blackwood asked probing questions of both sides, examined precedents, and weighed the evidence with the kind of attention that Zephyra had hoped for when she had supported his campaign years earlier. In the end, he ruled in favor of the community center, finding that Metropolitan Development Corporation had failed to prove that no alternative locations existed for their project, and that the public benefit of the community center outweighed the private interest in development. But more importantly than the ruling itself was what happened next. In the weeks following the case, Judge Blackwood implemented new courtroom procedures designed to ensure dignity for all participants. He required sensitivity training for court staff and began volunteering at the Harmony Community Center on weekends, not for publicity, but for personal growth. Zephyr never spoke publicly about the revelation of her anonymous donations, deflecting media attention with the same grace she had shown in the courtroom. When asked about Judge Blackwood's transformation, she simply said, "People can change when they're given the opportunity to see clearly." The Harmony Community Center not only survived but thrived. The attention from the court case brought new donors and volunteers, expanding their programs to serve even more community members. Zephyra finally bought herself new shoes, simple, comfortable ones that would last for years of service to others. Judge Blackwood kept a small card on his desk, a reminder of the lesson he had learned. It bore a quote from Harper Lee: "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." Every morning he would touch that card and remember the woman in broken shoes who had taught him that true justice requires seeing beyond surface appearances to the humanity that lies beneath. 6 months later, at the community center's annual fundraising dinner, Judge Blackwood stood to address the crowd. Zephyra had tried to convince the organizers not to invite him, worried that his presence might make the evening about their story rather than the center's work. "I want to tell you about a woman who changed my life," he began, his voice carrying across the packed room. "Not through grand gestures or public pronouncements, but through quiet dignity and persistent faith in the possibility of human growth." He spoke about judgment and prejudice, about the difference between charity and justice, about the courage required to help others without seeking recognition. He spoke about broken shoes and broken systems, about how one person's grace could illuminate another's blindness. "Zephyra Whitmore saved my soul," he concluded, "not because she funded my campaign, but because she refused to let my cruelty diminish her compassion. She showed me that the measure of a person isn't found in their possessions, but in their principles." The applause was thunderous, but Zephyra slipped quietly out the back door, as was her way. She had heard enough speeches in her lifetime, and preferred the simple satisfaction of seeing the community center bustling with activity. Proof that her investment, both financial and emotional, had yielded the returns that mattered most. This story reminds us that we never truly know the full story of the people we encounter. The woman in broken shoes might be the anonymous benefactor who changed your life. The struggling student might become the teacher who inspires thousands. The homeless veteran might have the wisdom that transforms a community. Judge Blackwood learned that day that appearances don't just deceive, they can destroy. When we judge others by their material circumstances, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to see their true worth, and them of their fundamental dignity. Zephyra's story teaches us that real power isn't found in wealth or position, but in character and compassion. She wielded more influence through her quiet grace than she ever could have through her anonymous donations. The broken shoes weren't a symbol of poverty. They were a testament to priorities. While others spent money on appearances, Zephyra invested in community. While others sought recognition, she chose service. While others demanded respect, she earned it through her actions. In our quick-to-judge world, this story challenges us to look deeper, to assume better, and to remember that every person we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about, and carrying gifts we might never recognize if we only see the surface. The next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance, remember Zephyra and her broken shoes. Remember that the person you're dismissing might be exactly the person you need most in your life. 2 years after the courthouse confrontation that changed both their lives, Zephyra Whitmore received an invitation that would reveal just how far the ripples of that fateful day had spread. The envelope was cream-colored and elegant, addressed in careful calligraphy to Ms. Zephyra Whitmore, founder, Urban Hope Foundation. Inside, an invitation to speak at the National Conference on Judicial Reform, with a note that read, "Your story has inspired changes in courtrooms across the country. We need your voice." Zephyra almost declined. Public speaking had never been her strength, and she preferred the anonymity that had served her so well throughout her philanthropic career. But something about the invitation's timing felt significant. The conference was being held in the same city where her husband had grown up, where he had first learned the values of quiet service that had shaped their marriage and her life's work. She accepted, not knowing that her decision would uncover a network of witnesses to that day in Judge Blackwood's courtroom. People whose lives had been quietly transformed by what they had seen. The first surprise came during her flight to the conference. The woman seated beside her, a middle-aged attorney named Celeste Morrison, struck up a conversation about their shared destination. "I'm presenting a paper on unconscious bias in judicial proceedings," Celeste explained. "It's fascinating research, really. We've documented how judges' decisions can be influenced by everything from a defendant's clothing to their posture, even their accent." Zephyra nodded politely, but something in Celeste's passion reminded her of her own advocacy work. "What got you interested in this research?" Zephyra asked. Celeste's expression grew serious. "I witnessed something 2 years ago that changed how I see the entire justice system. I was in a courtroom for a routine motion hearing when I saw a judge mock a woman for her appearance. The woman was representing herself in a case about a community center, wearing these old, patched shoes." Zephyra's breath caught. "You were there? You know about it?" Celeste asked, surprised. The story became something of a legend in legal circles. The woman turned out to be the anonymous donor who had funded the judge's entire campaign. It was like watching someone's soul break and rebuild itself in real time. What happened to the judge? Judge Blackwood. He became a completely different person, started advocating for courtroom dignity protocols, mandatory bias training for judges. He's actually keynoting this conference. But it was the woman who really inspired me. Her grace under that kind of humiliation. I'd never seen anything like it. Zephyr turned to look out the airplane window, watching clouds drift past like memories. What was so special about her reaction? She could have destroyed him, Celeste said quietly. She had the power to end his career with a single phone call. Instead, she used the moment to teach him, and everyone watching, about dignity and justice. I started my bias research that very week because of what I saw in that courtroom. The second surprise came at the hotel check-in. The young clerk, a college student named Marcus Chen, noticed Zephyra's conference badge and his eyes widened. "Wait," he said. "Are you Zephyra Whitmore, from the Urban Hope Foundation?" Zephyr nodded cautiously, still unused to being recognized. "You probably don't remember me," Marcus continued, "but I was doing court reporting as part of my journalism internship 2 years ago. I was in Judge Blackwood's courtroom the day the day everything changed." "You wrote about it?" "Actually, no. My editor killed the story, said it was too soft for our crime beat. But I kept my notes because something about that day felt important." Marcus lowered his voice. "I've been thinking about it ever since. The way you handled yourself, the way you turned that judge's cruelty into a teaching moment. It made me change my major. From journalism to social work. I realized I wanted to help people the way you help people. Not just write about problems, but actually solve them." He gestured around the hotel lobby. "I'm working here to pay for my MSW program. 3 more semesters and I'll be ready to open my own community center, modeled after yours." That evening, at the conference's opening reception, Zephyra encountered the third witness. Dr. Amara Okafor, a psychology professor specializing in dignity and shame dynamics, approached her with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been hoping to meet you for 2 years. I was serving jury duty in the courthouse that day, waiting in the hallway when the doors to Judge Blackwood's courtroom opened during recess. I heard people talking about what had happened. I study the psychology of public humiliation for a living, but I'd never seen anyone respond to it the way you did. Most people either collapse inward or lash out aggressively. You did neither. You maintained your dignity while simultaneously preserving his. It was masterful." Dr. Okafor pulled out her phone and showed Zephyra a book cover. "I've been writing about that day for 2 years. This book comes out next month. The Dignity Response: How Grace Under Fire Transforms Conflict. Your story is the central case study." "I never agreed to be studied," Zephyra said, a note of concern in her voice. "Of course not. I used pseudonyms and changed identifying details. But the psychological principles you demonstrated that day, they're revolutionary. You showed that it's possible to maintain personal dignity while helping someone else recover theirs. Most people think dignity is zero-sum, that lifting yourself up requires putting someone else down. You proved that wrong." The conference itself proved to be a revelation. Speaker after speaker referenced the Blackwood case as a turning point in their understanding of judicial bias and courtroom dignity. Zephyr realized that their private moment of pain and grace had become a catalyst for systemic change. Judge Blackwood's keynote speech was titled "The Woman in Broken Shoes: A Judge's Journey from Blindness to Sight." He spoke with the humility of someone who had confronted his own worst instincts and chosen to become better. "I want to introduce you to someone," he said near the end of his speech. "The woman whose patience and grace saved not just my career, but my soul. She didn't seek recognition then, and she doesn't seek it now. But her example has inspired changes in courtrooms across the nation." When Zephyra reluctantly joined him on stage, the standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. She looked out at the audience of judges, lawyers, and court administrators, and saw faces transformed by the possibility of justice served with dignity. "I never wanted to be a symbol," she said when the applause finally died down. "I just wanted to save a community center and be treated with basic respect. But I've learned that sometimes our most private struggles become public parables. Not because we choose it, but because the world needs the lesson." She paused, thinking of Marcus changing his major, of Celeste's groundbreaking research, of Dr. Okafor's book that would reach thousands of readers. Judge Blackwood and I learned something important that day. Dignity isn't about what you wear or how much money you have. It's about how you treat others and how you respond when you're treated poorly. Real change happens when we choose grace over grudges, when we see each other's humanity despite our differences. The woman in broken shoes had become something she never intended to be, a teacher whose classroom was the world itself, whose lesson plan was written in courage and compassion. As she left the stage, Zephyr realized that her husband would have been proud. Their quiet acts of service had created ripples that were still spreading, touching lives they would never know, in ways they could never imagine. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we plan to tell, but the ones we live without knowing anyone is watching.